What's up everybody, Coach Mills here, coming at you with a brand new Valorant video, and in this video we gotta break down 50 tips. That's right, 50 tips for Valorant that are gonna help you improve and climb that ladder. And I can't promise you that you haven't heard some of these tips before, but I can guarantee that there are gonna be many tips that you haven't heard of. So make sure you watch it to the end and absorb all 50 tips and then take it into your games and climb. But go to the Game Leap website right now for in-depth advanced VOD reviews, next level tips and tricks, and much more. Do yourself a favor, go check it out in the links down below right now. But without further ado, let's jump into the video. So I'm gonna waste no time because if I do, I'm not gonna be able to finish all 50 tips in this video in time. But the first tip is take a note of the enemy economy, specifically for range purposes. It's pretty obvious if you think about it, but if the enemy are poor, they're more likely to be running things like, judges, stingers, and shorties. And if you take longer engagements that are further away or just push areas of the map that have much more open space, then you're gonna have a lot easier time trading out with enemies that just don't have the means or the range to effectively combat you. Now, the next tip is take note of an enemy's ultimate economy because it's really going to change how you play. For example, if the enemy has an ultimate like Hunter's Fury, then he's way more likely to be far away from a spike that's planted, and if you tap it, you can typically bait out that Hunter's Fury. This is just one example of many of how just understanding that the enemy has an ultimate can help you better predict where the enemy is holding and how they are going to be playing the rest of the round, from playing slow and default when they have a Cypher ult to try to get a pick, or ultimates that can contest a certain area, just like that Hunter's Fury I talked about. This is a really important note to always keep in mind. Now, as an inverse to that first tip, as the third tip, you should be trying to play to your gun's strengths or figuring out a way to force an engagement that plays to your gun's strengths. For instance, holding a defensive position on Haven like Garage is going to be far better if you're stuck with a weapon like a shotgun, and maybe even doubling up a certain area can allow you to at least get that refrag 2-for-1 trade to better upgrade your weapon. Ultimately, you got to understand when some angles are just not angles that you're supposed to be challenging at all with your weapon choice, and you should only be challenging or taking engagements that you are much more favored to win in. Now, in tip number 4, you also need to be playing to the strengths of your character. Depending on the character you're going to be playing, you're going to be much more situated to play in certain points. For instance, some of them are obvious, like playing on specifically split on B-side defense. Cypher can have one-way trips and he can easily guard the entire point with his info, but other positions allow you to play much more aggressively and you have the means to do so, like Arena holding in that Haven Garage on defense, allowing her to flash out of Garage and make an aggressive play on grass or wrap around in mid. This is a perfect example of picking the right position that your character has the tools to make some play happen or defend much better. For the tip number 5, you need to understand that you can jiggle peek an angle without making noise by making only half a step and not making a full step out. This is hyper effective with counter strafing and crosshair placement, allow you to jiggle peek an area and clear it with the full swing of a counter strafe headshot, but at the same time not giving up your information if an enemy is indeed not there. For the next tip, you need to change how you're going to be playing versus other enemy characters and be ready for certain things that could happen. For instance, if the enemy has a Phoenix, you need to be always ready to 180 a flash whenever you're transversing from one natural cover to the next. And many characters are going to be like this, and if you understand what these characters could do, you can be thinking about how they can make a play on you and you could shut down it in return. For tip number 7, you need to be able to differentiate from defensive versus offensive smokes. Defensive smoke is going to want to actually be pushed off a site to where the smoke cutoff is barely at the cutoff of the point or the choke and the actual site itself, so that enemies can't push into your smoke and end up in the point that you're trying to defend, because that lets them take space on the point for effectively free and lets them kind of sneak up in obscure angles. Now, for an offensive smoke, you want the exact opposite, smoking in a way that lets you and your team walk through the smoke and get onto site to where you could push out from the smoke to multiple angles on the site and the enemy couldn't possibly be guarding all of those angles. Now, for tip number 8, you need to be thinking of the strengths and weaknesses of your team composition. Maybe you have a really sizable weakness where you don't have a smoke. However, there are always ways to play around a specific weakness, such as using flashes to cross through natural cover instead of using a smoke or LOS blocker, or using some comparable other abilities like flame wall and jet smoke to get you routed to the areas that you need to be. There's always something you gain from a weakness that you have in your team composition, so you need to find a way to win regardless of those weaknesses. weaknesses. Moving on to tip number 9, you need to be dictating the game with clear comms and taking the lead. I can't tell you how many times this is going to directly convert to you winning more games. When you are vocal in comms, vocal in direction, vocal in strategy, and you're clear and concise with everything you say, your team are automatically going to have a much better sense of direction than a team that just randomly does whatever they want from round to round, and only until they're down by 10 rounds do they say their first word. Now moving on to tip number 10, 35 seconds is the cooldown for Recon Arrow and Omen Smoke. And as Hiko talked about in a recent video we went over, this is going to be the time frame that engagements happen every 35 seconds at the 135 mark, the 1 minute mark, and the 25-second mark. But at a smaller level, just understanding that this is the cooldown for these powerful abilities that enemies typically push off of can allow you to make a game plan or be prepared and better predict when enemies are going to be pushing you. For tip number 11, the pinging system is great for pinging an angle that you think an enemy could be at that you don't necessarily know where it's at. For instance, if you want to jiggle peek shoot an angle and you don't want to actually peek that angle to figure out exactly where it is, just ping it and it'll be a lot easier. Or especially if you're blind or smoked off, you could ping a certain angle and swing it with intent, allowing for a lot easier conversion on these kills. For tip number 12, always ping the spikes for a team when you can't see. You need to do it earlier, not later. Don't wait for them to ask for it. This is something that is just so easy to do every single game, and you always need to be doing it. Moving on to tip number 13, buy for your allies and really pay attention to them. I can't tell you how many times I've seen this watching people's videos or even on stream in high-level games where people just don't buy for someone who needs a buy. Also, just speak up and ask, but don't spam buy, just say it in calm. For tip number 14, if you are following up an engager or an entry fragger, you need to not be afraid to peek the angle he died in and instantly refrag. How many times have you took a 1v1 with an enemy, killed them, and then there was a second person that swung you there and you're like, damn it, there were 2 people. Well, if you are too afraid to swing an angle after your entry fragger has died, then you let that other person off when you have been on the flip side of that same 2v1 engagement many times in the past and lost it. So why don't you take that free kill for your team? For tip number 15, make sure that your crosshair placement is close to a wall when you're wrapping it, so if an enemy's head pops up when you're slicing the pie, it will be easy. However, I do see that people have their crosshair too close to a wall when they expect an enemy to swing it, because enemies typically swing quite a bit further out, and it's going to be a lot harder for you to swing or flick to the right rather than having your crosshair already out quite a bit away from the wall. Now, the most used guns for eco to trade up in value is the Sheriff. That's really good for having decent crosshair placement and killing an enemy that slow peeks an angle. Stinger, that's great for rushing enemies. Shotguns that are fantastic for holding close angles, especially on defense. Or just the Classic, which is absolutely an insane gun. Speaking of the Classic, moving on to tip number 17, the Classic can one-tap full armor in the head if you get all 3 in the head, which is absolutely broken. But if you literally barrel stuff people with that Classic, it can win matchups that other guns simply cannot. For tip number 18, you need to be matching your buys and saves with your team, and it's the most important thing that you could be doing. It's better to buy and save at the same time rather than buying and saving at the right time. Big takeaway for you. Moving on to tip number 19, mix-ups can change momentum. Forced buying and pushing aggressively, for instance, is something that can fundamentally change the momentum of a game. For instance, if you're down 10-5, perhaps not only going aggressively on defense out of nowhere, but forced buying can be just the type of dynamic shift and unpredictability that the enemies are not expecting that allow you to not only win the round, but turn the momentum of the game in your favor. For the next tip, jiggle peek angles with your minimap, not your eyes. It makes it a lot harder for you to get hit, and you don't need to see the opper to know that there's an enemy there and for him to actually fire at you. Moving on to tip number 21, weapons like the Phantom, Stinger, and Spectre are literally run and gun from mid to close ranges. Abuse this versus very weak enemies or enemies that need you to be standing still for them to have easy shots on you, specifically one-tap weapons like the Guardian, the Operator, or of course the Sheriff. For the next tip, when you are very weak and you don't have that many abilities to use anymore, your role should now be Information Andy, where you go first in front of the pack, and when you die, your teammates can refrag off of you, because you getting one tapped in the head is not going to matter that much, because it was going to be very hard for you to follow up as a refrag, being so weak in the first place. For the next tip, tapping spike forces enemies to peek your LOS or line of sight of the spike to ensure that you are not sticking. Don't make any noise, however, or do anything to prove that you are not sticking after you tap that spike, or else an enemy will just never peek you. For the next up, sticking to half is the play when you know an enemy is too far away to contest you, or you know that you do not have enough time unless things go perfectly your way. Play it out, even if it's scary. Sometimes you have to play for that perfect scenario where you stick it to the half, an enemy peeks you, then you win that duel and you go back to defusing. Otherwise, you just simply won't have enough time to win the round. Joint wallbangs are amazing for clearing if you ping and call for it. Not used enough and can easily flush out enemies. Just ping an angle and say, hey, let's joint wallbang this in 3, 2, 1, easy kill. For the next tip, one of the biggest things that separates low level from high level play is discipline in using abilities to flush corners and slowly take control of some angles on site before full committing. This allows a lot easier engagements and refrags because you don't have to check every single angle. Instead, only certain angles on site gives you and your team much more direction and a much higher success rate as far as taking site control. Some maps are retake oriented and it's far easier to play for retake. For example, maps like Ascent on specifically A site take control of tree room and then smoke off main and execute on point with a Sova ability or something from heaven. You can wallbang the floors, you can wallbang the area to the generator, and you have the inherent high ground. So it's very, very easy to retake, and there's many points on many maps that are just like this. If you ever hear 2 updrafts from far away in rapid succession, look towards above the rooftops, because there are so many crazy rollouts by Jett with knives in particular that a Jett could be flying double updraft to get a cheeky kill, but if you set your crosshair placement to above rooftops, you might be able to actually kill her easily in return. Moving on to tip number 29, there is value in forcing out cooldowns, especially powerful ones like dash or forcing a Reyna to use dismiss instead of devour, as these are really abilities that allow the player to either get a kill and get out for free, or allow the person to get back to a full fighting force like devour. So just because you didn't get the kill doesn't mean you didn't get value if you force these abilities out. For tip number 30, you need to be planting with LOS of where you and your team are holding in mind and make it far easier to defend. You definitely want to make sure that you're planting LOS from the long sideline if your teammate is holding said sideline. And as a general rule of thumb, the more angles that your teammates can easily peek from where they're holding in their power positions, the more safely guarded the spike will be, and the easier it will be to contest enemies as they flush on to try to defuse it. For tip number 31, take straight up duels when you have an advantage. For instance, you don't want to get crafty and do some crazy routing things when the enemy's at 5 HP and you're at max, because any bullets you send their way, you're gonna win. However, if you are the 5 HP one, you want to set up a crafty duel where you flank around, tap the spike, and trick the enemy into checking an angle that you're not actually at, where you can shoot them when they don't have any chance to fire bullets back at you. Moving on to tip number 32, get a duo and combo some ability executes. Paranoia dash in, sky flashing, and swinging the angle with a fellow ally. Whatever the case may be, having a duo and trying to ability execute onto enemies is going to be a very consistent and reliable way to get free kills and impact. Moving on to tip number 33, you have more time than you think to get the op kill. Most of the time, and I'm gonna say like 90% plus, you are dying with the operator up against a rifle, not because you didn't shoot fast enough, but because you missed the shot instead. Slow down your shot and make sure you do hit it, because you do have more time than you think, but if you miss, it gives the enemy the confidence and the prerogative to push up and punish you. For tip number 34, you might not like this tip, but it's absolutely the truth. 99% of this game is crosshair placement, and it's not tracking and flicking. Adjusting for maps and common peak areas and having disciplined crosshair placement that pre-aims likely angles that enemies are going to peek from, because these make the shots much easier. And honestly, having disciplined crosshair placement is going to have faster time to kill than having an amazing flicking or tracking, because of the time it takes to flick across the screen coupled with reaction time. Now you're going to need to master 1 to 2 agents, but don't spread your agent pool too large, but learn the basics of everything. This is going to help you to better make plans to play differently against each agent, and on top top of that, you are not going to spread yourself too thin trying to master everything while just ending up mediocre at pretty much every agent. Now moving on to tip number 36, you can mix up where you're holding, specifically when you're having a rough time and a rough game. Sometimes it's good to get a complete mental reset and just swap positions that you're holding on defense with someone else. This gives you like a soft mental reset that's going to help you play a lot better. Moving on to tip number 37, playing default and playing for picks is a very powerful strategy against aggressive enemies, specifically when the enemies are pushing up aggressive when they're on defense. Hold angles, give no info, and catch up aggressive enemy players by being in perfect defensive positioning. For tip number 38, flanking is overpowered now that sentinels are nerfed. Flank hard on maps like Haven, Ascent, and Icebox. Specifically, Cypher traps are the only reliable form of anti-flank because Killjoy's anti-flank utility just gets disabled when she's too far away, and when that Cypher is dead, flank away. Moving on to tip number 39, musical chair ops, man. This is a topic that I talk about over and over again, but it's so powerful on an op. Play C one point, play A another point, play mid the other point, go to the high ground one time, push up another time. If enemies can never predict you when you're using an op, they can never shut you down, and one mistake by them and any lack of discipline is going to get you some free kills. For tip number 40, push up and hold across with an ally. This is really powerful in positions like bind A mid, where you could push up and hold each other's cross, guard each other's swings, and let you challenge an unsuspecting angle at the same time. When an enemy Phoenix or whoever is going to be setting up, they don't necessarily think you're going to peek that angle because it's vulnerable, but it's not vulnerable if you have an ally guarding your cross. Now, Phantom versus Vandal is mostly situational and personal preference. Typically, you're trading the range and the ability to take more effective 1v1s for a much easier to control weapon and a silencer, which allows you to better punish smoke. So it's a give and take situation. For tip number 42, you can abuse weapons like shotguns by taking control of enemy smokes, where enemies will smoke off a site and push in. But if you take that smoke first and an enemy tries to push inside, you'll be able to see them and trade out with them before they can fire back at you, which can not only stop their push on site, but allow you to easily trade up in weapon quality. For tip number 43, because of the new eco changes, dying can often be better than living and saving, because if the spike was not planted or if you made no effort to defuse it and you lived, you're gonna be stuck at a flat 1,000 credits gain compared to 2,100, 2,400, or 2,900 depending on your loss streak. You can always look in the top left exclamation mark to know the exact amount you specifically dying is gonna be worth in your given situation, and it can give you a better idea about whether or not you should really be pushing and trying to win even if you're gonna die anyways. Then we go to tip number 44. Tech does not matter a huge much as far as performance, but if I was going to give my number one suggestion for something you need to directly affect your performance the most in Valorant, I would suggest a 144Hz monitor with equal parts graphics that allow you to match that 144 FPS or higher in game, and turn all the graphics down if you have to. Get that 144Hz monitor. I promise it's going to change your life. Then we're going to tip number 45. Sometimes you just feel off, like you're having an off day. This might be because of your start position. The distance your chair is from your desk, your face is from your monitor, where your mouse and keyboard were in their start position. These are all things that actually innately matters because you want a form of consistency, and sometimes your body being shifted or just being off slightly can dynamically affect your aim in an FPS, so make sure that your start position is the same every single time, whether you're practicing or playing. For tip number 46, the best thing that you could be doing for improvement besides going to the Game Leap website is recording your own footage and watching it back. And honestly, you should be doing this as well as getting your Game Leap premium subscription. It's so amazing to actually improve, but be hard on yourself. Don't say, hey, I got 2 kills and we lost this fight. What the heck? Look at the fights or these specific engagements that you lost when you got caught out, when you died first, and ask yourself why this happened. Ask yourself what you could have done instead to actually have clutched up and been the difference maker or had impact in a different way to turn the round or the game. Now moving on to tip number 47, call exactly how much you tag someone for. Say Omen lit 30, clear and concise comms, nothing complicated, just always call. When you are in a gunfight with someone, call it out. I know you're gonna be ashamed that you only did 5 damage to them, doesn't matter, call out how much damage you did. Moving on to tip number 48, this is the 1 mute policy, and I saw this as a post on Reddit and I really agreed with this sentiment. If an ally ever says one thing negative, toxic, or passive aggressive, mute them instantly consistently, no exceptions. I promise you their input is not going to be worth your state of mind, because you getting tilted is the easiest way for you to start performing poorly. Plus, if they're going to be negative and toxic, how much value are they bringing to comms in the first place? Moving on to tip number 49, watch pro matches and streamers. This is going to improve your game sense, understanding pro matches and meta strategies, but watching streamers can show you some tips and tricks that they themselves are finding for the first time, or allow you to get little tips and tricks here or there. For the last tip that we got for you in this video, make sure that you're putting priority into grabbing orbs. This is a really underrated strategy, but definitely grab as many orbs as you possibly can. And on top of that, if you have the win in the bag, sometimes securing and going around the map to grab all the orbs while your 4 teammates are looking to finish off that one enemy player, that can be really good, because otherwise those orbs just disappear. But the last but certainly not least tip that I got for you in this video, tip number 51, is go to the Game Leap website right now for in-depth advanced VOD reviews. You want to see VODs where we break down step by step the decision making, plays, and mistakes from top level players. Then do yourself a favor, go check it out right now in the links down below. But thank you so much for coming by. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any other tips, definitely share them in the comments down below for the Game Leap community. But that's all I got for you today. Thanks so much for coming by. I'm Coach Mills, and of course, until next time.